So I was asked when we prepared this, what are your lessons learned, and I a few points I like to develop on the negative sides, you know, because if you look at it on the negative side, I think it makes it more clearer. The big mistakes I see of family-owned businesses, and my own family obviously had these mistakes too. Can talk about this for hours. The most obvious mistake is no clear strategy or a modeling through strategy. So you see a lot of businesses that, yeah, okay, they're okay, but they don't have a real strategy, they don't have a bold or realistic growth plan, and they just try to avoid difficult decisions. And that's obviously a mistake, because sooner or later reality will get back to you, and you are forced to do clear decisions. So develop a strategy for your business, but also develop a strategy for your family. And this obviously is always work in progress. You know, what's a sensible strategy today might not make sense in 5 years' time. So the process is always revolving. I think the biggest threat to the wealth of the family, and we had that in the generation of my mother obviously, a total lack of open and constructive dialogue in the family. So what happened is they run the business, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully, but there's no really constructive dialogue in the family about family issues and about the business. Generally, I think that has become better recently, because especially the young generations, you know, I coach 2 Swiss families right now where the young generation is obviously very open, very constructive, wants to talk about it. Also the parents are, because the parents are in their early 60s, you know. So probably, generally speaking, in a good way. And in the old system where you have the patriarch, you know, the strong family father who was suppressing any substantial discussion, these times are over. I also see a big threat if you have a lack of open and constructive dialogue between the family who owns the business and the management. Often the family is big and doesn't run the business, or only partly runs the business. And if you have no constructive dialogue between management and owner family, sooner or later you will run into trouble. And the interesting thing is, if you look, I do research and I love to look at very large and very successful family businesses. They all have these, they all avoid this mistake. So the large European family businesses we know, really successful over generations, large and small, they have exactly this. They have a process where they have an ongoing dialogue with management. So the management knows what the family expects, and the family knows from management what is possible and what is not possible. Another thing that struck me often in family businesses, that's family-owned businesses, just in case you don't understand this abbreviation, that's what we use, family-owned businesses. Loyalty over competence, you know, and this goes also back to a very good friend who runs, or rather is retired now, a large Swiss private bank that belongs to 2 families. And he told me an evening over dinner how difficult it is with one guy that was taught by the top management, totally incompetent, also be loyal to him, and huge problems. And he said, well, why don't you fire the guy? The guy is obviously causing a lot of problem, is causing a lot of problem. And he said something that I will never forget, and it's unfortunately true in many family businesses. He said, no, we cannot do this, because the guy was always loyal to the family. And he said, you know, Henry, in family businesses, it's often that loyalty to the family is higher valued than competence. And that's very, very dangerous. So obviously loyalty to the family is a very good thing. It's very important, but it has to be balanced by competence in the job you do. So make sure that when you promote people, that when you keep people, that their competence as a manager is as high as their loyalty to the family. This is also often seen, Charles and I, we know at least one or two examples, where unrealistic, too high cash drawings from the family actually ruin the family business. And many years ago I had a workshop with the Turkish entrepreneur, and I will never forget this. And he was asked by the audience, what's the biggest threat to your family business? What, to a family business? And he said, shall I really tell you? Everyone said, yeah, tell us. And he said, daughters-in-law. Well, everyone was shocked. Why daughters-in-law? Everyone was shocked, but he said, the biggest threat to a family business is a daughter or a son-in-law who expects a high cash drawing without any value. So that, and mine was a bit of a joke, but it's true for people who marry into the family, but sometimes it's also true for family members who are in the family, that they have just unrealistic, not supported cash requirements out of the company. And that can obviously ruin a company. I think when you're talking about third, second generation, it's always a mistake to neglect the history of the family. And it's obviously a big mistake in the succession process to involve your family too little and too late. That was often the case with the older generation. And I think my grandfather, to be transparent, he was a great guy, but I think that was his mistake, and I forgive him because he was born 1897, so different time. But he always, I think he always had the idea, I know best what the succession is, and there was no clear discussion with his children. Obviously, if you start a succession planning process in your family too late, then you do a big mistake because you reduce the time. That limits your option, and you should not forget the margin of error gets smaller the longer you wait. So I learned that from a friend, when you start early and your first succession model is a flop, you still have time to change it. You still have the ability to say, okay, this was a mistake, we try another way. You cannot do that if you're 75 and ill. Your options then are limited. So do it early. Now here is a topic that I think will be very emerging in the next 20 years, at least in the West. I'm not so sure here. But that's the phenomenon, and I will write the paper about that someday. That's the phenomenon of late fatherhood. In our ages, normally people become a parent in their mid-40s. And then when you have your first child with 45, as I had, it's very difficult to decide whether your first child will be a success or not, just for time. And the most extreme case is a friend of ours who owns a big retail and hospitality business. His first child was born when he turned 59. That's an extreme case, his life is okay. He's an extremely proud father, but I told him now, shit, you have to work for another 25 years till you can decide whether your daughter is a success or not. Obviously, he said that's not possible. So you have then this gap between, And in the West, I think we will see that more and more, because we all go to universities, we work abroad, we marry late, and the first children get, maybe you're 40 or even more. So that's an additional task, I think, that's coming. And I think it's also a common mistake that the options you see in succession planning are too narrow. So saying, I have 3 children and my only son is the successor. That's a narrow way of thinking. Because there might be also over generations, there might be a daughter or the younger son that turns out to be the best successor as the boss of the family and the boss of the business, the leader, and there will be other roles for other children, or the best option really is to sell the company. So when you think about your succession planning, please be open. And at the beginning of the process, you write down all the options you have. You always have the option to sell your business. You always have the option to split your business between different children, especially if you see that the children don't get along very well. There are so many options. And the common mistake I see is the lack or the absence of significant outsiders on the board. And what do I mean with significant outsiders? With significant, I mean competent and independent outsiders. And independent, and I'm sure Claude will talk about that because they did exactly that. In Vetropack they have competent and independent outsiders on the board. And I think that's very important. Once you grow, you get bigger, you get more international, you want to have independent people on the board. And independent means that their brain is independent from what you tell them, and financially they're independent from the job. So if they don't agree with you, basically they can run away. The lawyer who works for you or the consultant who works for you is not an independent man on the board because he gets a fair fee for his services. So keep that in mind. And I think that the weak family businesses I saw, they always, without any exception, have a problem here.